Good evening and welcome back to Drift Through History. Most of the stories we tell here are stories of systems, of empires built across generations, of institutions that outlasted their founders, of forces so large that no single person can quite contain them. Tonight's story is different in a specific and extraordinary way. Tonight's story is, almost entirely, the story of one man. Not one man in the romantic sense that popular history uses the phrase. One man as shorthand for a movement or a moment that is really the product of many forces. One man in the most literal sense. A single human being who, across 13 years of almost continuous campaigning between the ages of 20 and 32, personally led an army from the edge of Greece to the borders of India, destroyed the largest empire the Western world had ever known, founded more than 20 cities that still exist today, and set in motion a cultural fusion between the Greek world and the ancient civilizations of Persia, Egypt and Mesopotamia that would define the intellectual and artistic life of the Mediterranean for the next 300 years. His name was Alexander. His father was Philip of Macedon. His teacher was Aristotle. His horse was Bucephalus. His closest friend was Hyphasis. His ambition had no ceiling that anyone, including Alexander himself, could identify. And he was dead at 32, of fever or of drink or of both, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, having run out of world to conquer before he ran out of desire to conquer it. The story of Alexander is genuinely one of the most extraordinary lives in the history of any civilization. Not the most admirable. There is too much destruction in it. Too many cities burned and populations enslaved and cultures subordinated to the appetite of one man's ambition for comfortable admiration. Not the most important in terms of durable institutional legacy. The empire he built dissolved within 20 years of his death in ways that the Roman Empire or the Chinese Han Dynasty or the Islamic Caliphates did not, but extraordinary in the specific sense of exceeding by such a large margin what the available evidence suggested was possible. The gap between what Alexander accomplished and what any reasonable assessment of the available resources would have predicted was achievable is the thing that has drawn writers and historians and biographers to him across 23 centuries. We are still trying to understand it. Tonight, we are going to try. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is genuinely what you come here for. And as always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. There is something I find genuinely moving about this story being heard in different places simultaneously. Now, dim the lights. Let the room soften. Find a comfortable position and let your breath slow down. You have nowhere to be. And let us go back to the north of Greece, to a kingdom that most of the Greek world considered half barbarian, where a prince was being born who would change everything. Macedonia was not Greece, in the understanding of most Greeks in the 4th century BCE. The distinction matters, and its nuances are worth taking a moment to inhabit, because Alexander's relationship to the Greek world he would eventually champion was more complicated than the standard narrative of the Hellenic conqueror suggests. The city-states of classical Greece, Athens, Sparta, Thebes, Corinth, the dozens of other polis communities that dotted the Aegean coast and islands, understood themselves as participants in a specific and self-defining civilization, one organized around the polis, the city-state, as the basic unit of political and social life, and one that expressed itself in a shared religious tradition, a shared athletic festival culture centered on the Olympics and the other Pan-Hellenic games, and a shared literary and philosophical tradition that reached from Homer through Thucydides and Plato, and that was conducted in the Greek language in its various dialects. Macedonia, by contrast, was a kingdom of the northern interior, organised around monarchy rather than the polis system, ruled by a royal family whose Hellenic identity was sufficiently disputed that there had been debate at the Olympic Games about whether Macedonian royals were eligible to compete. The Macedonian language was either a dialect of Greek sufficiently divergent to be largely unintelligible to Athenians, or a separate but closely related language, depending on which ancient source you consult and which modern linguist you ask. The Macedonian aristocracy lived lives organised around hunting, drinking, and military service in ways that the more sophisticated urban culture of Athens found provincial, and that Athens and its intellectual circles occasionally described with the mild condescension that prosperous urban cultures direct toward their more militarized neighbors. The Macedonians, for their part, were aware of the Greek cultural achievements and aspired to them. Macedonian kings patronized Greek artists and thinkers, competed at the Olympics once their eligibility was accepted, and recruited Greek intellectuals to their court, while maintaining a distinct social culture that remained organized around its own traditions. Philip II, Alexander's father, was the king who transformed Macedonia from a mid-sized kingdom perpetually threatened by its neighbours into the dominant military power in the Greek world, and understanding what Philip achieved is essential to understanding what Alexander was able to do, because Alexander's conquests were built on foundations that Philip laid with a thoroughness and a strategic intelligence that deserves more recognition than it typically receives. Philip came to power in 359 BCE in circumstances of acute crisis. His older brother had just been killed in battle against the Illyrians, the Macedonian army was demoralized and poorly equipped, and several neighboring powers were pressing claims on Macedonian territory. He was 23 years old, and he had, by most accounts, spent time as a hostage in Thebes as a teenager, where he had observed at close range the military innovations of Epaminondas, the Theban general whose oblique attack formation and concentrated striking force of the Sacred Band had broken the military dominance of Sparta at Leuctra in 371 BCE, and who was the most innovative military thinker of the mid-4th century. What Philip built from these materials, the crisis he inherited, the Theban military education he had received, and the specific qualities of the Macedonian social military tradition, was the most formidable military instrument that the ancient world had yet produced. The Macedonian phalanx that Philip developed was a refinement of the Greek hoplite formation, armed with the sarissa, a pike roughly 5 to 7 meters long, dramatically longer than any weapon previously used by Greek infantry, whose length allowed the front 5 or 6 ranks of a phalanx formation to present a wall of overlapping pike points to any enemy they faced, creating a nearly impenetrable moving barrier that infantry armed with the conventional shorter weapons of the period could not effectively engage. The Macedonian cavalry, the companion cavalry, the hetairoi, the noble horsemen who were the king's personal military circle and the strike force around which Philip's tactical system was organized and equipped for the decisive shock action that Greek cavalry had never quite achieved, trained to operate in coordination with the infantry phalanx in the combined arms system that Philip developed and that Alexander would use to destroy every army it encountered. Philip also understood that military power without political management was merely expensive destruction, and he applied to his political operations across the Greek world the same combination of intelligence and ruthlessness that he applied to his military campaigns. He used money, marriage, diplomacy, threat, and direct force in whatever proportion the specific situation required, with a flexibility and a lack of ideological rigidity that produced results across the Greek world that pure military power would not have achieved. He defeated Athens and its allies at Chaeronea in 338 BCE, the battle in which the 18-year-old Alexander, commanding the companion cavalry on the Macedonian left, shattered the sacred band of Thebes and demonstrated for the first time the military ability that would define his adult life. And then, instead of destroying Athens as Sparta had destroyed its enemies in the previous century, he offered the Athenians remarkably generous terms. He understood that an Athens that hated him was a source of permanent instability, and that an Athens that could be brought to accept Macedonian leadership without excessive humiliation was a more useful instrument than a ruined city. The League of Corinth, which Philip organized in 337 BCE from most of the Greek city-states, was the political vehicle for Macedonian hegemony over the Greek world, a collective security arrangement in which the member states agreed to maintain peace among themselves and to support Macedonian leadership in the Pan-Hellenic campaign against Persia that Philip had been publicly advocating for years. The Persian campaign was not merely a strategic objective for Philip, it was also a political narrative, the invocation of the memory of the Persian wars of 480 to 479 BCE, when the Persian armies of Xerxes had burned Athens and profaned the Greek sanctuaries, was the ideological frame within which Macedonian military dominance over Greece could be presented not as conquest but as leadership, a shared Greek enterprise of vengeance and liberation, rather than the subordination of independent city-states to a Macedonian king. Philip was assassinated in 336 BCE at the wedding celebration of his daughter. The assassin was one of his own bodyguards, a man named Pausanias, whose specific motivations are debated in the ancient sources. Personal grievance against Philip, possibly related to a humiliation that had not been adequately addressed, is the most straightforward explanation, though the ancient tradition also implicates others in the conspiracy in ways that reflect the specific political anxieties of the moment. Philip's new wife, Cleopatra, of Macedon, not the Egyptian queen, but the young Macedonian noblewoman who had recently borne him a son, threatening Alexander's position as heir, was one possible beneficiary of his death, as was her powerful uncle Attalus. The Persian court, which had good reason to want Philip dead before his planned invasion could proceed, was another. Alexander himself cannot be entirely excluded from the ancient speculation, though the evidence is insufficient for accusation, and most historians treat his involvement as unproven and probably unlikely. What is certain is that when Philip died, Alexander moved with a speed and a decisiveness that suggested either extraordinary political instincts or extraordinary advance preparation. He secured the Macedonian army's loyalty within hours. He eliminated the rival claimants to the throne, including the infant son that Cleopatra had borne Philip and Cleopatra herself, with the ruthlessness that dynastic politics in the ancient world required, and that Alexander would demonstrate more than once in his subsequent career, when he felt the stability of his position demanded it. He was 20 years old, and within weeks of his father's assassination he was king of Macedonia, captain general of the League of Corinth, and the heir to the most powerful military machine in the Greek world. The world that Alexander was about to enter as a conqueror was the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and it is essential to understand what that empire actually was before following Alexander's armies into it, because the standard narrative of the Persian Wars, the Greek David defeating the Persian Goliath at Marathon and Thermopylae and Salamis, has given the Western historical tradition a persistently distorted image of Persia that makes Alexander's achievement seem more straightforward than it was. The Achaemenid Empire at its height in the 5th century BCE was the largest political organization the world had yet seen, stretching from the Aegean coast of Anatolia in the west to the Indus River valley in the east. from the Oxus River in the north to Egypt and the Persian Gulf in the south. It ruled perhaps 50 million people, roughly a third of the world's population at the time, across dozens of distinct ethnic, linguistic, and cultural communities, each with its own traditions and its own relationship to Persian authority. The administrative genius of the Achaemenid system was the satrapy, the provincial government, each administered by a satrap who was typically a member of the Persian royal family or a trusted Persian noble, that allowed the empire to govern its enormous diversity without the impossible demand that every subject community adopt Persian language and culture. The Achaemenid kings, Cyrus the Great, Darius I, Xerxes, and their successors, were practitioners of a specific and sophisticated imperial ideology that presented the king not as the conqueror who had destroyed local traditions, but as the legitimate successor to each conquered territory's own royal tradition, the protector of its gods and the guarantor of its laws. Cyrus's cylinder, the clay document from 539 BCE, in which the Persian king described his conquest of Babylon as the fulfillment of the Babylonian god Marduk's will, and his restoration of the cults and customs that the previous Babylonian king had neglected, was not merely propaganda but an expression of the genuine Achaemenid political philosophy of inclusive imperial authority. The Jews whom Cyrus released from Babylonian captivity called him the Lord's Anointed in terms that reflect the real impression the policy made on subject peoples accustomed to conquerors who simply imposed their own traditions on the conquered. By the mid-4th century BCE, the Achaemenid Empire was in a condition that historians have described variously as decline, instability, and internal tension, descriptions that are accurate in some respects and misleading in others. There had been a series of satrapal revolts in the 360s and 350s BCE, the Great Satrapal Revolt, in which several provincial governors had attempted to assert independence from the central government, an episode that suggested the bonds of imperial loyalty were under strain. The Western satrapies, which were closest to the Greek world and most exposed to the influence of Greek mercenary warfare, were the most restive. The Persian court had also been disrupted by a series of successions that involved the kind of dynastic violence, palace coups, assassinations, manipulations of the succession, that the Achaemenid political system was particularly prone to, because the practice of polygamy among Persian royalty, combined with the absence of a clear rule of primogeniture, to make every royal succession a potential crisis of competing claims. Darius III, who was the Persian king when Alexander crossed into Asia, had come to the throne through exactly this process. He was a relatively obscure member of a collateral branch of the royal family who'd been elevated to the throne after the elimination of several more direct heirs through court intrigue, and whose claim to the throne was consequently less secure than his predecessors. He was not, as the Greco-Roman tradition and its modern heirs have sometimes suggested, an incompetent or a coward. The ancient sources' characterization of him as fleeing his own battles, which reflects the perspective of his enemies, deserves more skepticism than it typically receives. He was a capable administrator who made rational decisions in several phases of the conflict with Alexander, and whose misfortune was to face an opponent whose military genius exceeded anything that the Persian imperial system had encountered before. The Persian army that would face Alexander was not, as the Persian War's tradition has suggested, a vast but poorly organized horde. It was a sophisticated military organization that combined the Persian noble cavalry, the immortals and the elite horsemen of the Iranian plateau, with Greek mercenary hoplites who were, man for man, as well trained as anything in Alexander's army, with the various military contingents contributed by the empire's subject peoples, whose fighting qualities varied considerably. The Greek mercenaries in Persian service were a particularly significant element, because they represented the same tactical tradition that Alexander's Macedonian infantry was built on, and provided the Persians with a reliable heavy infantry force that the native Persian infantry could not fully substitute for. Understanding that Alexander was fighting an empire that could field competent military forces, not just numbers, is essential to understanding why his victories were as remarkable as they were. Before the campaign began, before the army crossed the Hellespont and the spear was thrown into Asian soil, there were the years at Mieza, and they deserve more attention than the campaign's momentum typically allows them. The education that Aristotle gave Alexander between approximately 343 and 340 BCE was not merely a royal tutor's standard curriculum, and understanding what Aristotle taught and how he taught it illuminates the specific intellectual equipment that Alexander brought to the extraordinary project of his campaign. Philip had invited Aristotle to Macedonia in 343 BCE, with a commission that was, for the ancient world, unprecedented, to serve as personal tutor to the heir to the throne of the most powerful military state in Greece. Aristotle, who had spent 20 years in Plato's academy, had studied biology in Lesbos, and had recently been disappointed in his expectation of succeeding Plato as head of the academy, when Speusippus was chosen instead, accepted. He was given the sanctuary of Mieza, a shaded garden outside Pella, as the setting for his teaching, and the years he spent there with Alexander produced one of the most consequential teacher-student relationships in intellectual history. What Aristotle taught Alexander was, by all accounts, comprehensive: philosophy, medicine, rhetoric, ethics, politics, and what we would call natural science. The systematic observation and classification of the natural world that was Aristotle's primary intellectual project throughout his career. The Nicomachean ethics, the politics, the biological works, the great body of Aristotelian thought that would define European intellectual culture for 2,000 years, were not yet finished texts when Aristotle was teaching Alexander, but the questions and the methods and the specific analytical frameworks were all there, being worked through in conversation with a student whose intelligence and curiosity evidently impressed his teacher. The ancient sources preserve several anecdotes about their relationship. Aristotle's expressed interest in getting information about the plants and animals of Asia, Alexander's apparently genuine attention to medicinal botany during the campaign, the annotated copy of the Iliad that Aristotle prepared for his student, that suggest a pedagogical relationship of genuine intellectual seriousness. The specific aspects of Aristotle's teaching that most clearly marked Alexander's adult career were the emphasis on first-hand observation, on seeing for oneself rather than accepting received authority, and the teleological framework that understood every entity in terms of its proper function and its contribution to a larger whole. Alexander's insistence on personally investigating the terrain of his battlefields, his habit of riding ahead of his army to observe what lay in front, his specific attention to the local plants and animals and peoples of the territories he crossed, reflect the Aristotelian empiricism in its practical expression, the vision of a universal human community united under Greek philosophy and Greek reason that some ancient sources attribute to Alexander. The idea that the purpose of the campaign was not merely conquest, but the creation of a synthesis that would elevate all humanity, is more Aristotelian in its intellectual framework than Homeric, and suggests that the years at Mieza left deposits in Alexander's thinking that the campaign expressed in action. The relationship between teacher and student did not survive Alexander's execution of Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew, who died in Alexander's custody in 327 BCE, following the proskynesis controversy. Aristotle's own writings after this event contain passages critical of monarchical power that seem to reflect a personal disillusionment, and the tradition that Alexander became cold toward Aristotle in his later years has some support in the ancient sources. The teacher outlived the student. Aristotle died in 322 BCE, 1 year after Alexander, having returned to Athens after Alexander's death, and then fled when the anti-Macedonian reaction following Alexander's death made his position in Athens dangerous. He died at Chalcis on the island of Euboea, reportedly saying that he had not wanted to give Athens a second chance to sin against philosophy, an allusion to the execution of Socrates 77 years earlier. Alexander's campaign began in the spring of 334 BCE, when he crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait between Europe and Asia that separates modern Greece from modern Turkey, with an army of approximately 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. The crossing was itself a deliberate act of mythological self-consciousness. Alexander paused at the straits to throw a spear into Asian soil, claiming the continent by this archaic gesture as won by the spear, and then travelled to Troy, or what the 4th century BCE believed was Troy, the ruins, and the tumuli on the coast near the Hellespont, to make offerings at the tomb of Achilles. The identification with Achilles was not casual. Alexander had grown up with the Iliad as his primary text, had slept with a copy annotated by Aristotle under his pillow alongside a dagger, and had internalized the Homeric hero, quick to rage, glorious in battle, choosing a short and magnificent life over a long and obscure one, as the model against which he measured himself. The visit to Troy was the formal commencement of the heroic performance that Alexander understood himself to be giving. The first major engagement of the campaign came almost immediately at the Granicus River in northwestern Anatolia in May 334 BCE. The Persian satraps of western Anatolia had assembled a substantial force, perhaps 20,000 cavalry and a similar number of Greek mercenary infantry, and positioned them on the eastern bank of the Granicus, a river swift enough and steep-banked enough to provide a significant defensive advantage to the force holding the far shore. The Persian plan was, by ancient accounts, to use the cavalry along the bank to disrupt any crossing attempt, and then deploy the mercenary infantry to destroy the disordered force that made it across. The plan was tactically sound. Alexander disrupted it by attacking immediately, leading his cavalry into the river rather than waiting for the more cautious tactical approach that his senior general Parmenion recommended. The crossing under fire was extremely dangerous. Several of Alexander's closest companions were killed or wounded in the initial assault, and the fighting on the riverbank was among the most personally dangerous of Alexander's career. He was at one point surrounded by Persian nobles who had specifically targeted him, and the ancient sources preserve 2 accounts of how he was saved. One in which his general Cletus the Black cut off the arm of a Persian noble who had raised a battle-axe over Alexander's head, and another in which Alexander fought his way clear through his own ability. Both may be true. The battle ended in a decisive Macedonian victory, the Persian cavalry broken and scattered, the Greek mercenaries abandoned and then surrounded. Alexander offered the mercenaries terms and they refused. He attacked them and killed most of them, sending the survivors to Macedonia in chains on the grounds that Greeks who fought for Persia against the Pan-Hellenic Crusade deserved exemplary punishment. The victory at the Granicus opened the whole of western Anatolia to Alexander's advance, and the weeks that followed were a procession of city submissions rather than battles, as the Greek coastal cities of Ionia, cities that had been under Persian control since the early 5th century, and that had provided the original provocation for the Persian Wars, opened their gates and welcomed the Macedonian army as liberators. Alexander's policy toward the Ionian cities was carefully calibrated to serve the narrative of his campaign. He expelled the oligarchic governments that Persian authority had typically favoured and restored democratic constitutions, not because he was a committed democrat in any ideological sense. His domestic Macedonian government was a monarchy, and his treatment of political opposition within his own court was anything but democratic. But because the Ionian cities' democratic traditions were identified with resistance to Persia, and therefore served the liberation narrative that justified the campaign. Not all the cities submitted without a fight. Miletus and Halicarnassus, the great Carian city where the satrap Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek mercenary commander in Persian service who was probably the most capable opponent Alexander faced in the early phase of the campaign, had organized a serious defense, required siege operations that consumed weeks, and demonstrated that Alexander's army was as capable in siegecraft as it was in open battle. The siege train that Philip had developed and that Alexander had inherited, the torsion artillery, the siege towers, the engineering corps that could reduce almost any fortification given adequate time, was one of the elements of Macedonian military power that distinguished it from previous Greek armies, which had been largely incapable of taking strongly fortified cities. Alexander used it systematically throughout his campaign, and the cities that chose to resist paid in destruction what the cities that submitted avoided. The decision Alexander made at Miletus to dissolve his fleet was one of the most counterintuitive strategic choices of the early campaign, and one of the most revealing about the quality of his strategic thinking. He had a fleet, assembled from the naval contributions of the League of Corinth members, but it was significantly smaller than the Persian fleet and did not operate safely in the eastern Mediterranean against Persian naval superiority. Rather than risk it in an engagement he might lose, Alexander decided to deny the Persian fleet its operational utility by capturing the coastal ports from which it operated, to defeat the Persian navy by conquering the land, taking away its bases, supply lines, and the shipbuilding resources of the Phoenician and Egyptian coast. It was a strategy that required confidence in the army's ability to advance far enough and fast enough to achieve these objectives before Persian naval pressure on the Greek world created political pressures at home that he could not manage from Asia. It also required the political stability of the League of Corinth, which depended on Greek acquiescence to Macedonian leadership that was not guaranteed if the campaign went badly. The strategy worked because the land campaign succeeded quickly enough to neutralize the naval threat before it became decisive. The march through Anatolia in 334 to 333 BCE brought Alexander's army through terrain of extraordinary historical density, past the ruins of civilizations older than Greece itself, through the Phrygian plateau where the legendary King Gordius had tied the knot that the oracle said only the future ruler of Asia could undo. The Gordian knot episode is one of the most famous stories about Alexander, and its ambiguity is deliberate. Some ancient sources say he cut it with his sword, others say he drew out the pin that held the wagon pole and untied it, by loosening the entire mechanism rather than finding the ends of the rope. What the sources agree on is the result. Alexander left Gordium having solved the problem by whatever means he employed, and the oracle was fulfilled, and the army moved on. Whether the story is literally true, embellished, or entirely invented in the tradition that always grew around Alexander's actions, it captures something real about his approach to obstacles. He engaged with them directly, and on his own terms rather than on the terms that the obstacle's framing suggested. It was also in Anatolia, at Tarsus in Cilicia, in 333 BCE, that Alexander suffered the only serious illness of his campaign, a fever contracted apparently from swimming in the cold Cydnus River after a hard march that brought him close to death and that created the first major succession crisis of the campaign, when no one was entirely sure that the king would survive. His physician Philip of Acarnania treated him with a strong purgative that Alexander agreed to take despite a letter from Parmenion warning that Philip had been bribed by the Persians to poison him. Alexander handed the letter to Philip, drank the medicine while Philip was reading the accusation, and recovered. The story is told in all the major ancient sources, and whether it is true in its details or a constructed parable about Alexander's trust in those close to him, it became one of the defining anecdotes of his character, the willingness to trust completely, to commit fully, to live or die by his own judgment rather than by the cautious middle ground. The illness at Tarsus also had strategic consequences, because while Alexander was recovering, Darius III was assembling the largest army that the Achaemenid Empire had yet put in the field, and was moving it toward the Levantine coast. The army Darius had assembled at Issus in Cilicia in November 333 BCE numbered, by ancient estimates, in the hundreds of thousands, estimates that modern historians universally reduce, but that was certainly a force many times the size of Alexander's 40,000. The Battle of Issus was the first direct confrontation between the two kings, and it produced one of the most consequential military outcomes in the ancient world. The terrain at Issus was the decisive factor, and Alexander had deliberately manoeuvred to ensure that the terrain would favour his smaller, more cohesive force. Darius had advanced into the narrow coastal plain between the Amanus Mountains and the sea, a space too constricted for the full deployment of his superior numbers. Alexander's phalanx held the Persian centre, while Alexander personally led the companion cavalry in a charge against the Persian left, where Darius was positioned. The weight of the cavalry charge broke through the Persian left, and Alexander wheeled toward the centre, heading directly for Darius. What happened at the moment of the Persian king's encounter with Alexander's charge is the subject of the most famous surviving image of the ancient world, the Alexander mosaic found at Pompeii and now in the Naples Archaeological Museum, showing Alexander on Bucephalus charging toward a terrified Darius in his chariot, the Persian king already in the gesture of flight. Darius fled the field, his army collapsed. The aftermath of Issus produced one of the great diplomatic exchanges of the ancient world. Darius's mother Sisygambis, his wife Statera, his daughters, and his son had been with the army and were captured when the Persian camp was taken. Alexander's treatment of them was deliberately exceptional. He sent word that Darius was alive and unharmed, that the royal family would be treated with the honour appropriate to their rank, that Alexander would respect Sisygambis' dignity as a queen and address her as such. When Alexander visited the royal family in their captivity, Sisygambis mistakenly prostrated herself before Hephaestion rather than Alexander. Hephaestion was taller and more physically imposing, and when the error was corrected, Alexander reportedly said that the confusion was understandable because Hephaestion was also Alexander. The line, whether accurately preserved or constructed in the tradition, captures the intimacy of the relationship between Alexander and his closest companion, and the specific quality of Alexander's generosity toward defeated enemies that was one of his most consistently maintained personal characteristics. Darius sent envoys after Issus offering terms, an enormous ransom for his family, the cession of all Persian territory west of the Euphrates, and the offer of an alliance ratified by marriage. Parmenion, Alexander's senior general, reportedly said that if he were Alexander, he would accept these terms. Alexander's reply, that if he were Parmenion he might, but being Alexander, he would do otherwise, was one of the characteristic moments of the campaign. He declined. He had not come to accept a portion of the Persian Empire. He'd come for all of it. The campaign that followed Issus spent 2 years on the Levantine coast before Alexander could move into the Persian heartland. And the delay was deliberate and strategically necessary. The Persian fleet was still operating in the eastern Mediterranean, and the coastal cities of Phoenicia, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, the great port cities whose maritime tradition went back to the Bronze Age, and whose shipbuilding and navigational expertise had made them the maritime powers of the ancient Mediterranean, were either Persian allies or Persian subjects whose naval resources would be available to the Persian fleet as long as the Persians controlled the coast. Alexander needed these cities, and most of them submitted when the opportunity presented itself. Tyre did not. The siege of Tyre in 332 BCE was the most technically demanding military operation of Alexander's campaign, and its outcome was one of the most dramatically complete demonstrations of what the Macedonian siege capability could accomplish against even the most formidable fortification. Old Tyre on the mainland had already submitted, but the great city of Tyre was on an island, a heavily fortified rocky island about half a mile offshore, ringed with walls that rose in places to a height of 40 meters and defended by a garrison whose naval capability made it able to resupply and reinforce by sea. Conventional military logic said Tyre was impregnable to a land force without naval superiority. Alexander built a causeway. He extended a mole, a constructed land bridge, from the mainland shore to the island, using the rubble of old Tyre as his building material, driving the construction forward under fire from Tyrian artillery and Tyrian ships, advancing the siege towers on the mole as its surface hardened and widened, until the island that had seemed permanently separated from the mainland by half a mile of water was connected by a constructed land bridge that the Macedonian siege equipment could traverse. The construction took 7 months. The Tyrians burned the first siege towers. The Macedonian fleet, reinforced when the Phoenician and Cypriot city fleets defected to Alexander, eventually secured the sea around the island and denied the Tyrians their maritime supply. When the walls were finally breached in July 332 BCE, the city was taken by storm. 6,000 Tyrians were killed in the fighting. 30,000 survivors were sold into slavery. 2,000 captive soldiers were crucified on the beach. The brutality of the sack of Tyre was not an aberration in Alexander's conduct. It was a policy, the calculated demonstration that cities which chose to resist rather than submit would be treated with extreme severity, while cities that submitted would be treated with generosity. The policy worked on a cold military logic that Alexander applied consistently. The contrast between Tyre's fate and the fate of cities that had surrendered was the most effective possible advertisement for submission, and the subsequent capitulation of Gaza and the swift opening of Egypt suggested that the lesson was being learned. Egypt received Alexander as a liberator rather than a conqueror, and the specific quality of the Egyptian welcome. The Persian satraps surrendered the country without significant resistance. The Egyptian population received Alexander with what the sources describe as genuine enthusiasm, reflected both the genuine unpopularity of Persian rule in Egypt, which had been experienced as harsh and disrespectful of native religious traditions, and the specific Egyptian understanding of what Alexander's arrival meant within their own political theology. Alexander went to Memphis, where he was acclaimed pharaoh in the traditional Egyptian ceremonies, offering sacrifice to the Egyptian gods and specifically to the Apis bull, a gesture that the Egyptian priests found theologically correct and politically meaningful. He was not merely a conqueror absorbing Egypt into a new empire. He was, in the Egyptian understanding of the ceremony, the legitimate heir of the pharaonic tradition, the son of Amun as previous pharaohs had been, the rightful ruler whose arrival had restored the proper cosmic order. The foundation of Alexandria was the most enduring single act of Alexander's Egyptian visit, and it was accomplished with characteristic speed and characteristic vision. Alexander chose the site himself, a strip of land on the Mediterranean coast west of the Nile Delta, between the sea and the inland lake of Mareotis, where a natural harbour could be improved by construction, and where the prevailing winds and currents made it the most accessible point on the Egyptian coast from the Mediterranean. He is said to have laid out the basic plan of the city himself, using grain to mark the lines of the streets and the public spaces when chalk was unavailable. The city that grew on this plan across the following decades and centuries would become, in the Ptolemaic period, the largest city in the world after Rome, the greatest centre of learning and book collection in the ancient world, the home of the famous library and the museum, the city where Euclid wrote his Elements and Archimedes did some of his work, and the Jewish scriptures were translated into Greek, and the astronomical calculations that would define ancient cosmology were conducted. It would take 100 years to reach its full greatness, but the site Alexander chose and the city he named for himself would outlast every other consequence of his campaign. The visit to the oracle of Amun at Siwa, deep in the Libyan desert west of Egypt, was the most mysterious and most debated episode of Alexander's Egyptian interlude. He made the journey, a grueling march of several hundred miles across desert terrain, with a small group of companions, and the oracle consulted him in private, in the inner sanctuary of the temple. What the oracle said to Alexander was never revealed publicly. The ancient sources report that he received confirmation of his divine parentage, that the god had addressed him as son, and that whatever else was communicated satisfied him profoundly, though he would not share the content. The specific claim of divine sonship, of being, in some sense, the son of the Zeus Ammon rather than of Philip, was one that Alexander maintained in various forms throughout the rest of his campaign, and the question of what he actually believed about his own divine nature, as opposed to what he found politically useful to promote, is one that the ancient and modern sources has discussed without resolution. The most honest answer is probably that the distinction between genuine belief and political calculation is one that Alexander himself may not have found entirely meaningful. The return from Egypt and the decisive engagement with Darius's full army was the campaign's central military drama, and the Battle of Gaugamela, fought in October 331 BCE on a plain in what is now northern Iraq near the city of Arbela, was the largest and most carefully planned battle of Alexander's career. Darius had spent the 2 years since Issus rebuilding his army and preparing the specific military responses to what he understood to be the Macedonian tactical system. He had ordered the battlefield at Gaugamela to be levelled, the ground prepared to eliminate any terrain features that might break the continuity of his cavalry lines, allowing him to use his numerical superiority in cavalry effectively. He had equipped his scythed chariots, war chariots with blades extending from their axles designed to carve through infantry formations, for a specific deployment against the Macedonian phalanx. He had recruited more Greek mercenaries, deployed more war elephants, organised his forces with a care that reflected real military intelligence. Alexander's reconnaissance was thorough enough that he understood Darius's preparations in considerable detail, and his planning for Gaugamela was as elaborate as anything in his military career. Parmenion, commanding the Macedonian left, reportedly advised a night attack to prevent Darius from using his numerical superiority effectively. Alexander declined. It would be disgraceful, he reportedly said, to steal a victory, and besides, he trusted the outcome in open battle. He reorganized his army on the battlefield to address the specific threats Darius had prepared, creating a refused flank on the right that could wheel back if encircled, stationing specialized infantry to deal with the scythed chariots, positioning his hypaspists as the flexible link between the phalanx and the companion cavalry on the right. The battle itself was one of the most complex and closely run of Alexander's campaign. The scythed chariots were largely neutralized by infantry who opened lanes for them and then attacked the horses and drivers from the sides. Parmenions' left came under severe pressure from Persian cavalry and sent word to Alexander that he needed help, creating the central tactical dilemma of the battle. Alexander, on the right, had created the gap in the Persian line toward which he was driving his cavalry toward Darius, but Parmenions' left was in danger of being overrun. Alexander chose to continue his charge toward Darius rather than divert to relieve the left, and the charge worked. Darius fled again, the Persian centre collapsed, and the defeat of the Persian army was complete before the pressure on Parmenions' wing became catastrophic. The decision to press the attack rather than respond to Parmenions' distress call was the most tactically aggressive choice of Alexander's career, and it worked. But it was close enough that a different outcome was entirely possible. After Gaugamela, the Persian Empire ceased to exist as a functioning political entity. Babylon surrendered without a fight. The Babylonian priests and merchants who managed the great city's commercial and religious institutions calculated correctly that the Persian king who had just lost his army was less useful to them than the Macedonian king who had just won, and they sent delegations to meet Alexander on the road with offerings of hospitality. Alexander entered Babylon in triumph, made offerings to the Babylonian gods, gave orders for the restoration of temples that the Persians had damaged, and stayed long enough to receive the homage of the city's population and to organize the administrative arrangements for Babylonian governance. He was following, consciously or by instinct, the same Achaemenid ideology of inclusive imperial authority that Cyrus the Great had practiced, presenting himself not as the destroyer of the old order, but as its legitimate continuation under new management. To understand the emotional and cultural weight of what Alexander was approaching when his army marched on Persepolis, it is worth pausing to understand what Persepolis actually was. Not the ruined columns that the modern tourist photographs, magnificent as those are, but the living city at the height of its power that the Macedonian army entered in the winter of 330 BCE. Persepolis, Parsa in Old Persian, the city of the Persians, was not the administrative or commercial capital of the Achaemenid Empire. It was its ceremonial centre, the place where the empire's idea of itself was expressed in architectural form at the largest possible scale. Darius then had begun its construction around 518 BCE, and successive Achaemenid kings had added to it across 2 centuries, creating a complex of audience halls, storehouses, royal apartments, and religious structures on an artificially levelled terrace of rock that rose from the plain like a deliberate statement about the relationship between royal power and the natural world. The Great Apadana, the audience hall of Darius and Xerxes, supported by 36 columns rising more than 20 meters, was the room in which the king received the representatives of the empire's subject peoples, each bringing their specific tribute and their specific gifts, each depicted in the famous processional reliefs that still line the stairways of the terrace. Lydians with horses, Armenians with vases, Indians with donkeys, Babylonians with cloth, Egyptians with cattle. The empire in miniature, processed in stone into an image of the world under Achaemenid order. The treasury of Persepolis that Alexander captured was not merely the Persian king's personal wealth, but the accumulated stored value of 2 centuries of Achaemenid tribute collection, a concentration of gold and silver whose scale the ancient sources describe in terms that historians have found both plausible in outline and impossible to verify in detail. Modern estimates, working from the ancient accounts and from what is known about Achaemenid tribute rates, suggest figures in the range of 180,000 talents of silver equivalent, enough to pay Alexander's entire army for decades, enough to fund the economic life of the Hellenistic world for the following generation, enough that simply transporting it required a logistical operation that rivaled the military campaign in its complexity. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire, fell in January 330 BCE, and its fate is the most controversial single act of Alexander's campaign. The treasury of Persepolis was the richest single accumulation of wealth in the ancient world. Ancient sources describe the transfer of its gold and silver to the Macedonian treasury in terms that suggest an almost incomprehensible concentration of treasure, requiring thousands of pack animals to transport. The city itself was given over to the Macedonian troops for looting, which produced a sack of considerable destructiveness. Then, several months after the army's arrival, the great palace complex of the Achaemenid kings was burned. The burning of Persepolis is the subject of 2 conflicting ancient accounts. One, more credible to most modern historians, presents it as a deliberate strategic decision, the symbolic destruction of the Achaemenid royal palaces as the final act of the Pan-Hellenic War of revenge for the Persian burning of Athens in 480 BCE, a calculated political gesture that completed the narrative arc of the campaign. The other, more romantic account preserved in several ancient sources describes it as the result of a drunken suggestion by the Athenian courtesan Thais, who reportedly called on Alexander to burn the palace of Xerxes in symbolic revenge for the burning of Athens, acted upon impulsively during a drinking party and immediately regretted. Alexander's reported remorse at the ashes of Persepolis the following morning suggests that even if the decision was strategic, its execution was not entirely sober. The truth may contain elements of both versions. A strategic calculation that was given the specific form of its execution by the intoxicated atmosphere of a military celebration, and that the sober aftermath made seem less carefully considered than it had seemed at midnight. Darius, still alive after Gaugamela, and still technically king of Persia, was fleeing east with a diminishing retinue, attempting to reach the eastern satrapies where he hoped to rebuild his position and continue resistance. Alexander pursued with a speed that his veterans found extraordinary even by Macedonian standards. The pursuit of Darius across the Iranian plateau in the summer of 330 BCE was conducted at a pace that left the main army behind, and required Alexander to press forward with a flying column of cavalry and lightly equipped infantry, covering distances in days that would normally have taken weeks. He nearly caught Darius at Ecbatana. He nearly caught him again on the road east of the Caspian Gates. When he finally reached Darius, the Persian king was already dead, murdered by his own satraps, principally Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, who had decided that a living Darius was a liability, and a dead Darius was either an excuse to negotiate with Alexander or a vacancy to be filled by someone more capable of continued resistance. Alexander found Darius in a wagon on the road, dying of spear wounds. By the ancient accounts, Alexander covered the body with his own cloak. He arranged for Darius to be buried with royal honours in the royal tombs at Persepolis. He announced that the murder of Darius was a crime that he would avenge, but Bessus and the other murderers had killed their king and would answer for it. The gestures were both genuine and politically calculated. Genuine because Alexander's personal code required respect for a royal opponent and for the specific bond between them that the campaign had created, and calculated because presenting himself as the avenger of Darius gave Alexander the most powerful possible claim to be Darius's legitimate successor, the rightful king of Asia, rather than merely its conqueror. The final phase of the campaign, the pursuit of Bessus through the eastern satrapies, the reduction of Bactria and Sogdiana, modern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, and the invasion of India, was militarily the most demanding and culturally the most complex of Alexander's entire career. The eastern satrapies were not the wealthy, urbanized, culturally sophisticated territories of Babylon and Egypt and Persepolis. They were mountainous, sparsely populated, culturally distinct from the Western Iranian tradition, governed by local chieftains whose loyalty to the Achaemenid system had always been more contingent than the loyalty of the core Persian territories, and resistant to conquest in ways that a conventional pitched battle could not resolve because the opposition took the form of guerrilla warfare. The targeted attack, the sudden ambush, the withdrawal into terrain that the Macedonian army's tactical strengths were not designed for. Bessus was captured in 329 BCE, handed over by his own allies after they calculated that handing him to Alexander was safer than continued association with a losing cause. Alexander had him mutilated in the Persian manner, nose and ears cut off, before sending him to Ecbatana for trial and execution, a treatment that the ancient sources comment on as a departure from Alexander's usual magnanimity toward defeated enemies, and that reflects both the political importance of treating Darius's murderer with Achaemenid-style justice, and perhaps something about Alexander's personal feeling for the man who had murdered his royal adversary. The guerrilla campaign in Sogdiana, conducted from 329 to 327 BCE, was the longest and most frustrating phase of the entire eastern adventure. The local resistance, organized by a Sogdian chieftain named Spitamines, combined hit-and-run raiding with the strategic use of terrain, the river valleys, the mountains, the vast spaces of Central Asia, to exhaust the Macedonian forces in a way that no pitched battle had managed. Spitamines was eventually betrayed and killed by his own followers, who sent his head to Alexander, but the campaign had cost 3 years, significant casualties, and a degree of frustration that expressed itself in episodes that the ancient sources record, and that modern historians have found difficult to fully reconcile with the more admiring image of Alexander. The massacre of the population of the Sogdian city of Persepolis, the execution of the Branchidae, a community of Greek descent who had served as priests at a temple near Miletus and had betrayed it to the Persians 150 years earlier, whose descendants Alexander apparently tracked down in Central Asia and killed in collective punishment for their ancestors' act. It was in Bactria that Alexander met Roxane, the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman named Oxyates, and married her in a ceremony that combined Macedonian and Bactrian traditions, apparently including the bread-sharing gesture from the Bactrian wedding ritual, in 327 BCE. The marriage was diplomatically useful, converting a potentially hostile Bactrian noble family into allies through the mechanism of dynastic connection, but the ancient sources are unanimous in suggesting that it was also a genuine love match, that Alexander was genuinely attracted to and attached to Roxane in ways that went beyond the purely diplomatic. She was the only one of his 3 eventual wives. He married Statera, the daughter of Darius, and Parysatis, another Persian princess, in the mass wedding at Susa in 324 BCE, whose son he apparently acknowledged as heir. The affair with Roxane was not the only indication that Alexander's engagement with the cultures he conquered was going beyond the political necessity of inclusive imperial management and becoming something more personal and more philosophically ambitious. The gradual transformation of Alexander's court and Alexander's self-presentation across the years of the campaign was one of the most carefully watched and most hotly debated aspects of his reign, and it deserves some careful attention before we arrive at the specific crisis of the proskinesis controversy, because the individual episodes, the Persian dress, the adoption of the diadem, the increasingly elaborate court ceremonial, were each small steps in a process whose cumulative effect was visible and troubling to those who'd known him longest. After the capture of Persepolis and the assumption of the Persian kingship, Alexander had begun to adopt elements of Persian royal dress and court protocol, not by abruptly abandoning Macedonian custom, but by gradual incorporation, appearing sometimes in Macedonian military dress, and sometimes in what the ancient sources describe as a hybrid costume that combined elements of both traditions. The long robe, the girdle, the upright headdress of the Medes, these were not the full Persian royal costume, which Alexander apparently decided was too far a step for too early a stage, but they were sufficiently un-Macedonian to generate comment. The Persian nobles in his entourage found the adoption of some of their customs respectful and appropriate. A king who dressed entirely as a Macedonian while ruling Persia was in their understanding a foreign conqueror rather than a legitimate successor to the Achaemenid tradition. The Macedonian veterans found it disturbing, evidence of what they described as an un-Macedonian pretension that the success of the campaign had inflated into something they did not recognize, the parallel development of Alexander's treatment of his Persian subjects, the appointment of Persian satraps alongside or instead of Macedonian ones, the integration of Persian noble cavalry units into the army, the specific honour shown to the families and the customs of the conquered aristocracy, was understood by Alexander as the necessary business of ruling a vast multi-ethnic empire, and it was, by any rational assessment of the alternatives, probably the correct policy. A Macedonian occupation government that simply imposed Macedonian customs and Macedonian personnel on the entire Persian administrative apparatus would have required far more Macedonian personnel than Alexander had, and would have alienated the Persian administrative class whose cooperation was essential for governing the empire. The integration policy was intelligent, but it was experienced by many Macedonian veterans not as intelligent policy but as betrayal, as the progressive displacement of the men who had won the empire by the men who had lost it. The drinking that became more prominent in the later years of the campaign was part of this cultural tension, and the ancient sources note it with a consistency that suggests it was real rather than a later literary construction. Macedonian court culture involved heavy drinking as a normal part of the symposium tradition, and Alexander had been a drinker from his youth, but the specific combination of stress and grief and the psychological accumulation of 13 years of extraordinary effort seems to have intensified his drinking in ways that his companions noted with concern. The murder of Clytus had happened at a drinking party. The burning of Persepolis, in the Romantic version, had happened at a drinking party. The final illness that killed him was preceded by at least one major drinking session. The ancient sources that describe Alexander as a heavy drinker in his later years are reflecting something real about how the campaign's costs expressed themselves in him. The proskinesis controversy of 327 BCE was the most dramatic internal crisis of the campaign after the murder of Clytus, and it revealed the depth of the tensions between Alexander's evolving imperial self-conception and the Macedonian tradition he had come from. Proskinesis, the gesture of prostration performed before the Persian king was, in the Persian tradition, a normal expression of respect for royal authority, practiced by Persians and by the subject peoples of the empire as a matter of course. It was not, in the Persian understanding, a religious act. It did not imply the worship of the king as a god. But in the Greek understanding, proskynesis was specifically a gesture of religious submission, performed only before the gods, and its performance before a human being was a humiliation incompatible with the dignity of a free man. When Alexander attempted to introduce the practice at his court in Bactria, requiring Macedonian nobles and Greek courtiers to perform proskynesis along with the Persians who already practiced it, the resistance was immediate and ultimately insurmountable. The philosopher Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew, who had been serving as the campaign's official historian, led the opposition, arguing publicly that Alexander was a man, not a god, and that requiring Greeks and Macedonians to prostrate themselves before him was a violation of the fundamental distinction between human and divine that Greek religion and philosophy maintained. The confrontation between Callisthenes and Alexander was followed shortly by the discovery of the conspiracy of the pages, a plot among Alexander's royal pages to assassinate him, which may or may not have had a genuine connection to Callisthenes, but which provided the pretext for his arrest and eventual death in custody. Alexander abandoned the attempt to introduce proskynesis for his Macedonian and Greek courtiers. He had encountered, in the specific form of his own army and court's resistance, the limits of how far the cultural fusion he was attempting to create could go in the lifetime of the man who was creating it. The murder of Clitus the Black, which occurred in Maracanda and Sogdiana in 328 BCE, was the darkest episode in Alexander's personal life and the one whose psychological aftermath most clearly reveals the specific nature of the burden he was carrying. Clitus was one of Alexander's oldest companions, the man who had saved his life at the Granicus, a tough, straight-spoken Macedonian soldier of the old school, who had watched the campaign's increasing adoption of Persian customs with growing unease and who expressed that unease at a drinking party in Maracanda in terms that Alexander found intolerable. The exchange escalated. Clitus compared Alexander unfavourably to Philip. Clitus shouted that it was his black hand, the hand that had saved Alexander at the Granicus, that Alexander should thank, not the gods he was increasingly claiming for his parentage. Alexander seized a spear from one of his guards and killed Clitus where he stood. The grief that followed was total and prolonged. Alexander shut himself in his quarters for 3 days, refusing food and drink, tearing at his hair, calling Clitus's name. His companions eventually persuaded him to emerge. The philosophers in his entourage offered him the consolations of their various schools. The Anaxarchus, who told him that a king's acts were by definition just, was probably not helpful, but the attempt to help was genuine. Alexander was not consoled. The killing of Clitus, of the man who had saved his life, at a drinking party, in a rage over criticism, stayed with him, a specific weight that the ancient sources suggest he never fully set down. The invasion of India, which began in 327 BCE, when Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush into the Indus Valley, was the final, and in some ways the most extraordinary phase of the campaign, extraordinary because of the specific combination of military brilliance and personal hubris that it represented. Alexander had, by 327 BCE, already gone further and accomplished more than any Greek, Macedonian or Persian general before him. He had his empire, he had his cities, he had the wealth of Persepolis, he had the diplomatic achievement of Roxane's marriage and the integration of Persian nobles into his court and army. He could have stopped. He did not stop. He went to India. The specific military challenge of India was different from anything the campaign had previously encountered. The subcontinent Alexander entered was organized around city-states and kingdoms that were generally independent of each other, and the local chieftains and kings whose territories he crossed faced him with varying responses. Some submitted immediately, some fought with considerable stubbornness, and the specific geography of the Punjab, with its rivers and its jungles and its heat, presented challenges that the Macedonian army's experience in the Iranian plateau and the Bactrian mountains had not fully prepared it for. The elephant, which Alexander first encountered in significant numbers in India, was a genuinely unsettling element of the local military tradition, a multi-ton animal capable of disrupting infantry formations with a thoroughness that neither the sarissa nor the cavalry had a clean answer for. The Battle of the Hydaspes, fought in June 326 BCE against Porus, the king of the Paurava kingdom east of the Hydaspes River, was one of Alexander's greatest tactical achievements and one of the most beautifully planned battles of the ancient world. Porus had positioned his army on the eastern bank of the Hydaspes, which was in monsoon flood, and running high enough to make a frontal crossing extremely hazardous. He had positioned his elephants at the crossing point to destroy any force that made it across in disorder. Alexander spent weeks conducting feints along the bank, moving his troops noisily as if preparing for a crossing, forcing Porus to respond each time and then standing down, until the repeated false alarms had convinced Porus that the maneuvers were meaningless noise. Then, in a thunderstorm that covered the sound of his movement, Alexander crossed at a point upstream from Porus's position, appearing on the eastern bank with his cavalry before Porus had time to fully respond. The battle that followed was won by the combination of Alexander's cavalry on the flanks, driving the Indian cavalry onto the infantry, and the Macedonian infantry's careful management of the elephants, the archers targeting the mahouts, the infantry opening lanes to let the elephants pass and then attacking them from the sides and rear, gradually driving the animals back into the Indian formations where they caused as much damage to their own side as to the Macedonians. Porus was captured, fighting on the back of his largest elephant until he was too wounded to continue. When brought before Alexander, he was asked how he wished to be treated. He answered, "As a king treats a king." Alexander returned his kingdom to him and went further. He gave Porus additional territory, recognizing in him the kind of magnificent, dignified opponent that his heroic code required him to honor. The banks of the Hydaspes were also where Bucephalus died, the great horse that Alexander had ridden since childhood, that Philip had bought at the market and that the young Alexander had famously tamed while Philip's stable hands had failed to, was now old and had been spared combat in the most recent phase of the campaign, but died, probably of age and exhaustion, shortly after the Hydaspes. Alexander founded a city near where Bucephalus died, and named it Bucephala. It was one of the more personal acts of commemoration of the entire campaign, the naming of a city for a horse, and it reflects something genuine about the specific depth of Alexander's attachments, which were intense and loyal and expressed in concrete, permanent forms. The end of the advance came at the Hyphasis River in the late summer of 326 BCE, and it came not from military defeat but from something that Alexander had never previously encountered: refusal. His army refused to go further. The specific form the refusal took was Macedonian, not insubordination, but an assembly of his senior commanders, at which Conus, speaking for the army, told Alexander that the men had given everything and would not give more, that they wanted to go home, that the gods themselves had limits, and that a campaign without a foreseeable end was not a campaign but an exile. Alexander retired to his tent for 3 days, the same retreat into solitude that he had made after Clitus, and emerged to announce that the gods had given signs unfavourable to further advance. He would not ask his men to go where the gods did not sanction. The retreat from the Hyphasis westward was not, in Alexander's conception, a retreat. He turned south down the Hydaspes and the Indus, fighting coastal campaigns through the Punjab and Sindh that included some of the most dangerous moments of the entire expedition. At the city of Multan, breaching the walls ahead of his troops, Alexander was struck by an arrow in the chest that pierced his lung and came close to killing him. His companions who reached him over the wall found him unconscious and bleeding, and the anger of the troops when they learned that their king had put himself in lethal danger ahead of the army, forcing them into the worst imaginable situation of trying to rescue their unconscious commander from a hostile city, was expressed in terms that reflected the genuine terror of what Alexander's personal battle style was costing them. He survived. He made it clear that he would continue to command from the front and that his men should expect it. The journey home, through the Gedrosian desert, the most inhospitable terrain in the known world, a vast expanse of waterless gravel and salt flat on the Persian Gulf coast, was the most terrible suffering the army endured. Alexander chose the route partly because he wanted to accomplish what no commander before him, including Cyrus and Semiramis, had managed, to cross the Gedrosian desert with an army. The price was catastrophic. The sources differ in their casualty figures, but the death rate among the army and the camp followers, the tens of thousands of non-combatants who travelled with the Macedonian army, was enormous. The heat killed, the thirst killed, the sand killed. The army that had crossed India came back through the Gedrosian desert as a ghost of what it had been, and the stories the survivors told of the crossing were the darkest in the entire campaign. At Carmania, beyond the worst of the desert, the army met the returning fleet under Nearchus, which had sailed from the Indus mouth through the Persian Gulf in an equally extraordinary navigational achievement. The reunion was celebrated with the degree of relief that the surviving sources preserve in their emphasis on the feasting and the drinking, the specific release of men who had survived something that had seemed unsurvivable. Alexander met Nearchus, and when Nearchus reported that the fleet had arrived safely, Alexander reportedly wept. The specific combination of relief and gratitude and the emotional rawness that comes from having driven men past what seems possible. The final years in Persia, from 324 to 323 BCE, were not peaceful. Alexander was reorganizing his empire with the energy and the systematic intelligence that had characterized his military campaigns. But several of the specific decisions he was making were generating resistance among his Macedonian commanders and troops that had no military outlet, and therefore expressed itself in the specific forms of court intrigue and mass grievance that peacetime frustrations produce. The Opis Mutiny of 324 BCE, when a large portion of the Macedonian army refused orders and accused Alexander of preferring his Persian and Asian subjects to his Macedonian veterans, was the most serious domestic crisis of the mature campaign. Alexander's response was characteristically dramatic. He addressed his troops directly, recounting in extraordinary detail everything Philip had done and everything he himself had accomplished, asking rhetorically what any man in the army wanted for that he had not received, and then dismissing all his Macedonian troops from service and threatening to make a new army entirely from Asians. The troops broke before Alexander did. The emotional intensity of the scene, Alexander's genuine grief and anger, the Macedonian soldiers' realization that they had gone too far, the reunion that followed, is one of the most humanly immediate episodes in the ancient sources. The death of Hephaestion in Ecbatana in October 324 BCE was the worst personal loss of Alexander's life, and the event whose psychological consequences the ancient sources describe most extensively. Hephaestion had been Alexander's closest companion since childhood. They had grown up together, been educated together, shared the entire campaign from the Granicus to the Indus, and their relationship was the most intimate of Alexander's life in ways that the ancient sources decline to specify precisely, and that modern interpreters have discussed at length. When Hephaestion died of fever, the ancient sources say he had been recovering from illness, and his doctor had relaxed the dietary restrictions, and Hephaestion had feasted and drunk, and relapsed catastrophically. Alexander's grief was extravagant even by the standards of ancient royal mourning. He lay across Hephaestion's body for a day and a night. He cut his own hair, the traditional Homeric gesture of mourning. He had the doctor crucified. He ordered the manes and tails of all the horses cut in mourning. He sent to the oracle at Siwa asking whether Hephaestion could be worshipped as a god. The honours that Alexander demanded for Hephaestion's funeral were on a scale that consumed an enormous amount of the empire's resources and attention, and the ancient sources' accounts of the funeral pyre at Babylon. A multi-story construction decorated with figures of ships' prows, burning eagles, seated archers and lions, gilded torch-bearing sirens encasing musicians, whether literal or somewhat embellished in the tradition, suggest a man spending money and attention on grief at a scale that had no parallel in the ancient world. That the grief was genuine is not in doubt. That it was also a performance of grief consistent with the heroic code. That mourning Hephaestion the way Achilles had mourned Patroclus was part of the narrative that Alexander was living, does not make it less genuine. Alexander was capable of experiencing genuine emotion and performing it simultaneously, and the distinction between the two would not have seemed coherent to him. The mass wedding at Susa in 324 BCE was one of Alexander's most deliberate and most carefully staged acts of imperial policy, and it deserves attention as the clearest single expression of his vision for what the empire he had built was supposed to become. At Susa, Alexander married two Persian princesses, Statera, the daughter of Darius, and Persepolis, the daughter of the previous Persian king Artaxerxes III, in ceremonies conducted in the Persian manner. He simultaneously organized the marriages of approximately 90 of his senior Macedonian officers and companions to women of the Persian and Median nobility, providing each couple with a substantial dowry from the royal treasury. Hephaestion married Drypetis, another daughter of Darius, so that his children and Alexander's would be cousins. This symbolism was clear and deliberate. Alexander was creating a ruling class of mixed Macedonian-Persian descent, binding the military aristocracy of the conquerors to the noble families of the conquered through the most permanent of social bonds. Whether the policy would have worked, whether the children of these marriages would have grown up with the hybrid identity that the vision required, loyal to both traditions, capable of governing an empire that encompassed both, cannot be known because Alexander died too soon for the experiment to reach its first generation. What is known is that most of the Macedonian officers divorced their Persian wives after Alexander's death, suggesting that the policy had not created the depth of personal commitment that Alexander's vision required, and that the speed with which the empire fragmented after his death reflected. The specific question of what Alexander intended for his empire, what the end state looked like if he had one, is one that the ancient sources debate and that modern historians have continued to debate without resolution. The Eratosthenes tradition, preserved in Strabo, suggested that Aristotle had advised Alexander to treat Greeks as friends and Persians as enemies, and that Alexander had rejected this advice in favour of treating all men by the standard of virtue rather than ethnicity. Whether this represents Alexander's actual philosophical position or a later Hellenistic reconstruction of his policy in more universalist terms than the historical Alexander would have used is debatable. What is not debatable is that the policy of cultural integration, the deliberate effort to create a ruling class and an administrative system that transcended the distinction between conqueror and conquered, was a real feature of Alexander's empire in its final years, whatever its ultimate philosophical foundations. Alexander died in Babylon in June 323 BCE at the age of 32. The specific cause has been debated since antiquity. The ancient sources describe a prolonged fever following a drinking party, at which Alexander had consumed substantial quantities of wine, and most modern medical analysis has concluded that the most plausible diagnosis is either typhoid fever, complicated by alcohol-related immune suppression, or bacterial infection, or some combination of factors. The poison theory, that Alexander was deliberately poisoned by his generals or by Aristotle's great-nephew Antipater, has circulated since antiquity and has been supported by some modern forensic arguments. But the consensus remains that disease, complicated by the physical accumulation of 13 years of extreme campaigning in its wounds, is the most likely explanation. In the days before his death, as it became clear that he would not recover, Alexander's companions and commanders pressed him for guidance about the succession. To whom did he leave the empire? The answer he gave, or was reported to have given since the details of his final days are disputed in the sources, was to the strongest, or to the best. The phrase, if he said it, was not an abdication of responsibility, but an honest assessment of a situation that he was too weak to resolve, and that the political reality of his court and army would have made unresolvable even at full strength. He had no adult son. Roxane was pregnant but had not yet given birth, and the child's sex was unknown. He had several potential successors among his generals, all of them capable, none of them obviously superior to the others, and no institutional framework that would allow the question to be decided by anything other than force. The wars of the Diadochi, the successors, that consumed the generation after Alexander's death were among the most consequential and most violent episodes in ancient history. The generals who had served Alexander divided the empire through a series of wars and negotiations, betrayals and alliances that extended across 40 years before the dust settled into the pattern of Hellenistic kingdoms that would define the political map of the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia until the Roman conquest. Ptolemy took Egypt and founded the Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule it until Cleopatra, the last Ptolemaic ruler, dying 3 centuries after Alexander's conquest. Seleucus took the Babylonian and Persian heartland and founded the Seleucid Empire that, at its height, controlled more territory than any successor state. Antigonus and his son Demetrius fought for Macedonia and the Aegean. Lysimachus held Thrace. The various arrangements were unstable, contested, and continuously renegotiated through warfare across the following decades. Alexander's mother Olympias, his half-brother Philip III, his wife Roxane, and his infant son Alexander the Thor were all killed in the political violence of the succession period, systematically eliminating the direct Argead line that might have provided a focus for dynastic legitimacy. The empire Alexander had built was gone within 20 years of his death, broken into the successor kingdoms that would gradually consolidate into the pattern of the Hellenistic world. What survived was not the political structure, but something more diffuse and more permanent: the cultural synthesis that Alexander's conquest had initiated, the spread of Greek language and thought and art across the eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia, the specific fusion of Greek and Persian and Egyptian and Babylonian intellectual traditions that would produce the Hellenistic civilization of the following 3 centuries. The Hellenistic world that Alexander's conquest created was not simply a world in which Greek culture had been imposed on the East. The reality was considerably more interesting and more genuinely reciprocal than the standard Hellenization narrative suggests. And understanding what the cultural synthesis actually produced requires attention to what flowed eastward as well as what flowed west. The specific intellectual exchange that the Hellenistic period enabled ran in both directions with genuine productivity. Greek astronomers in Alexandria had access to the Babylonian astronomical records, observations of planetary positions and eclipses collected across centuries by Babylonian priestly astronomers, that provided the empirical data on which Hipparchus's star catalogue and the broader development of mathematical astronomy depended. The Greek mathematical tradition, which had developed the formal apparatus of proof and deductive reasoning to a level of sophistication that the Babylonian mathematical tradition had not reached, combined with the Babylonian empirical astronomical tradition, which had the observational data and the numerical methods that Greek astronomy lacked, to produce in the Hellenistic period the most sophisticated astronomical science the ancient world achieved. The Antikythera mechanism, the extraordinary bronze computing device recovered from a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera and now recognized as the world's first analog computer used to calculate the positions of celestial bodies, was a product of this combined tradition, an artifact that demonstrates the specific quality of the intellectual achievement that the Hellenistic synthesis enabled. The medical tradition underwent a similar synthesis at Alexandria, where the anatomical work of Herophilus and Erasistratus, the first systematic human dissection in Western medical history, conducted in Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE with the explicit support of the Ptolemaic court, combined Greek philosophical frameworks about the body with Egyptian embalming traditions that had given Egyptian physicians a practical knowledge of human anatomy that the Greek tradition's religious prohibition on dissection had prevented it from developing. The specific advances in anatomical knowledge that Herophilus and Erasistratus made, the identification of the nervous system, the distinction between veins and arteries, the understanding of the brain as the seat of intelligence rather than the heart, were foundations on which Galen built 5 centuries later, and that defined medical understanding into the early modern period. The philosophy that flourished in the Hellenistic period, Stoicism, Epicureanism, skepticism, the various other schools that emerged in the generation after Aristotle, was shaped by the specific cultural and political environment that Alexander's conquest had created. The Stoic concept of the cosmopolis, the universal city of reason in which all rational beings are citizens regardless of their ethnic or political origin, is the philosophical articulation of the political reality that the Hellenistic world had created, a world in which Greek-speaking people of many different national origins lived alongside each other in the great cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, and in which the old framework of the polis, the citizen community of a specific city, no longer adequately described the social reality of educated people whose intellectual and commercial life was genuinely cosmopolitan. Stoicism, the philosophy that proved most durable and most influential in the Roman world, was founded by Zeno of Citium, a Phoenician from Cyprus, not a Greek by ethnic origin, who came to Athens and created the most important philosophical school of the Hellenistic period in a tradition that explicitly transcended ethnic identity. The Hellenistic world that Alexander's conquest created was not simply a world in which Greek culture had been imposed on the East. It was a genuinely new cultural synthesis in which Greek and Eastern elements combined in different proportions in different places to create things that neither tradition had produced separately. The city of Alexandria was the most spectacular example, a city in which Greek political and intellectual culture, Egyptian religious tradition, Jewish scholarship, Babylonian astronomical knowledge, and the commercial energy of one of the world's great ports combined to produce the most intellectually productive urban environment of the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria, which at its height contained several 100,000 scrolls, virtually the entire literary and scientific production of the ancient world, was the institutional expression of the specifically Hellenistic drive to collect, organize, and synthesize knowledge from every tradition the Greek-speaking world could access. The specific intellectual achievements of the Hellenistic period, Euclid's Elements, which organized the entire body of Greek mathematical knowledge into the axiomatic system that geometry still uses, Archimedes' work on mechanics and hydrostatics, Eratosthenes' calculation of the circumference of the Earth, Aristarchus's heliocentric model of the solar system, the astronomical calculations of the Babylonian tradition, absorbed and extended by Greek astronomers, were products of this cultural environment that Alexander's conquests had made possible. The Greek language, which Alexander's campaigns had spread as the language of administration and commerce across the entire eastern Mediterranean and into Central Asia, became the linguistic medium through which the intellectual traditions of the ancient world could communicate with each other, and the specific body of the knowledge produced in that medium formed the foundation on which both the Roman intellectual tradition and eventually the Islamic Golden Age built. The religions of the Hellenistic world also reflected the cultural synthesis. The ruler cults that Alexander had initiated, the worship of living kings as divine figures, which had been standard in Egypt and Near Eastern tradition, but was new to the Greek world, became a standard feature of Hellenistic political culture, each Hellenistic dynasty maintaining its own divine or semi-divine royal persona. The mystery religions that spread throughout the Hellenistic world, Isis worship from Egypt, the cult of Mithras from Persia, various Anatolian mystery traditions, were products of the cultural mixing that Alexander's conquests had initiated, and that the Hellenistic trade networks had sustained. The specific intellectual and religious environment of the Hellenistic world was the context in which early Christianity developed and spread, which makes Alexander's conquests a background condition for one of the most consequential religious developments in the history of Western civilization. The practical legacy in the material world is visible wherever the archaeology of the Hellenistic period has been seriously pursued. The city of Ai-Khanoum in what is now Afghanistan, excavated by French archaeologists in the 1960s and 1970s, and then damaged by the conflicts of the late 20th century, was a Hellenistic city on the Oxus River, near the northeastern corner of Alexander's conquests, complete with a Greek theatre, a gymnasium, a palace complex, and inscriptions in Greek, that demonstrates how thoroughly the Greek urban model had been transplanted to the very edge of the ancient world. The coins of the Hellenistic kingdoms, struck in Greek style, bearing the portraits of Greek-speaking kings inscribed in Greek, circulated from the Mediterranean to India, and show how completely the commercial and political language of the Greek world had permeated the territories Alexander had crossed. Alexander himself left no writings. He was not a writer, but a doer. in the specific sense that the Homeric world he had internalized valued. Action was the medium in which he expressed himself, and he expressed himself in it with a completeness and a commitment that left nothing for the page. The accounts of his campaign that survive, Arrian's Anabasis, written in the 2nd century CE, from the lost accounts of Ptolemy and Aristobulus, who had been participants in the campaign, Diodorus Siculus's account, Plutarch's Life of Alexander, Quintus Curtius Rufus's history, are all written centuries after the events they describe, working from sources that were themselves written with varying degrees of accuracy, political motivation, and distance from the events. The Alexander we know is a literary construction assembled from incomplete and partial evidence by authors who were themselves shaped by the legend his life had already become. This does not make the historical Alexander inaccessible, but it does require a certain humility about the specificity of what we can claim to know and what we are assembling from the tradition that surrounds the man. Before we attempt the final assessment that the story demands, it is worth saying something direct about the specific problem of historical knowledge that Alexander's life presents, because it is more acute for Alexander than for almost any other figure of the ancient world, and the specific quality of that problem shapes everything we can confidently claim about him. The fundamental difficulty is this. Every ancient source for Alexander's life that survives was written more than 300 years after the events it describes. Arrian's Anabasis, the most comprehensive and generally most reliable narrative, was written in the 2nd century CE, roughly 450 years after the campaign it describes. Plutarch's Life of Alexander dates to the same period. Diodorus Siculus's account was written in the 1st century BCE, approximately 300 years after the campaign. The earlier accounts, the histories of Ptolemy and Aristobulus, who had actually been present in the campaign, the official history of Callisthenes, and several others written by participants or near contemporaries, have all been lost and survive only in fragments preserved in later works. We are reading accounts of accounts of accounts, filtered through the specific literary and political concerns of authors who were themselves centuries removed from the events they described, and who were working in the context of a legend that had already hardened around Alexander, to the point where it was extremely difficult to separate the historical man from the mythological one. This does not mean that historical knowledge of Alexander is impossible. Arrian was a careful historian who stated his method clearly, explained his preference for Ptolemy and Aristobulus as sources, and acknowledged uncertainty where the sources conflicted. The papyri and inscriptions and coins that archaeology has recovered provide independent evidence that can sometimes confirm or contradict the literary sources. The physical geography of Alexander's campaign, the routes, the rivers, the distances, the terrain, can be verified and provides a reality check on accounts that describe events in specific locations. The Persian administrative documents from the period, the Babylonian astronomical diaries that preserve specific dated records, the material evidence from the cities Alexander founded, all of these provide partial but real independent evidence for specific events and conditions. But the inner life, the private conversations, the specific thoughts and feelings and motivations that give a biographical account its texture, these are almost entirely literary construction, the product of sources that were working from earlier sources, which were themselves already shaped by the specific way that Alexander's campaign had been narrativized for literary purposes from the very beginning. Callisthenes, who travelled with the campaign as its official historian, was writing propaganda as well as history. And his Alexander was already the heroic figure that the campaign's ideology required, rather than the full and contradictory human being that a private journal might have captured. By the time Arrian and Plutarch were writing, the tradition had been worked over by so many hands and so many purposes that separating historical fact from legendary accretion requires a degree of skeptical vigilance that the inherent drama of the material makes difficult to maintain. What this means practically is that the Alexander we know is, to a significant degree, a shared cultural artifact, a figure constructed from the combination of whatever historical reality lies behind the sources and the specific narrative and moral and philosophical uses to which 2.5 millennia of engagement with his life have put that figure. This is not a reason to abandon the history. It is a reason to hold it with appropriate humility, to be clear about what the evidence actually supports and what represents interpretation or tradition, and to remember that the man who rode Bucephalus across the Granicus River was a specific human being whose full experience of his own life was far more complex and far less legible to posterity than the magnificent, terrible, extraordinary figure that the tradition has preserved. The question that Alexander's life poses most urgently to historical understanding is also the question that is hardest to answer. What was he for? What, beyond the conquest itself and the cultural consequences that flowed from it, was the point of what he was doing? The ancient sources give different answers. The Romantic tradition presents him as driven by pothos, a Greek word that means something like longing or yearning or desire, used in the ancient sources to describe the specific quality of Alexander's ambition, the reaching for what was over the horizon, the restlessness that could not be satisfied by any achievement, because the next achievement was always there. The philosophical tradition presents him as motivated by the ideal of bringing Greek civilization to the world, of creating a unified human community governed by Greek reason and Greek justice. The more cynical modern interpretation presents him as driven by the specific psychology of a young man raised to believe himself exceptional, trained by the world's greatest philosopher, given the world's greatest army, and constitutionally incapable of stopping. All three interpretations contain truth. The pathos was real. The ancient sources describe it consistently enough that it seems genuinely characteristic, and the specific pattern of Alexander's campaign, which always found a new objective just as the previous one was achieved, suggests a psychological dynamic that the satisfaction of any particular goal could not interrupt. The civilizing mission had some genuine content. Alexander's deliberate promotion of cultural fusion, his recruitment of Persian and Asian nobles into his court and army, his founding of cities that would transmit Greek culture deep into Asia, reflected something more than pure military strategy. And the specific psychology of a young man shaped by Philip's example, Aristotle's teaching, and the Homeric ideal into someone who experienced limitation as a kind of death, is as good a psychological explanation as any for the specific shape of his ambition. What is certain is that the world was different after Alexander than it had been before him in ways that are still with us. The Greek language he spread became the language in which the New Testament was written. The cities he founded carried the Greek cultural tradition to places it would otherwise not have reached for centuries, if ever. The cultural synthesis he initiated produced the intellectual environment in which the major advances of ancient science were made. The destruction he caused, the cities burned, the populations killed or enslaved, the indigenous political structures eliminated, was real and enormous and should not be romanticized. The two things coexist. He was brilliant and he was catastrophic, generous and ruthless, personally loyal and dynastically murderous. a man of extraordinary human depth who lived at a speed that precluded the reflection that depth required. He was 32 years old when he died, and the ancient sources agree that he was already planning his next campaign. The night is settling in now, and the long story of Alexander has reached its end, or the end of the life at least, because the consequences of the life extend much further and are still in various threads present in the world we inhabit. The cities with Alexander's name, not just Alexandria in Egypt, which is still there on the Mediterranean coast where he placed it, but the other Alexandrias scattered across the map of his campaign in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iran and Uzbekistan, are still there, carrying his name in forms that local languages and the centuries have modified but not entirely dissolved. The tradition of the great commander, of the military leader, who transformed not just the battlefield but the world, that Alexander established is one that every subsequent conqueror from Caesar to Napoleon explicitly invoked. Caesar wept at a statue of Alexander, reportedly, because at the age at which Alexander had already conquered the world, Caesar had accomplished nothing comparable. Napoleon kept a portrait of Alexander in his study and described him as the greatest captain in history. These are not coincidences. The specific figure of Alexander set a standard of military and political ambition against which Western civilization measured its subsequent great men for 23 centuries, and the standard was set so high that it has never been surpassed in the specific dimensions that Alexander achieved it. The world he crossed is still there. The Hindu Kush mountains that his army struggled through in winter still rise above Afghanistan with the same contemptuous indifference to human ambition that they showed his sarissa-carrying infantry. The Hyphasis, now the Jhelum River in Punjab, Pakistan, still flows from the Himalayas to the Indus with the same monsoon weight that it was running with when Alexander crossed it in the night and the thunder. The plain near Arbela where Gaugamela was fought, now near the city of Erbil in Iraqi Kurdistan, is farmland now, as it was then, and gives no particular indication of what happened on it in October 331 BCE, except for whatever the soil holds that the plough has not yet turned. Aristotle's student walked across most of that terrain personally, on foot or on horseback, in 13 years. He crossed the Hindu Kush twice. He crossed the Tigris and the Euphrates and the Oxus and the Indus. He fought in the Aegean and the Levant and Egypt and Mesopotamia and Persia and Central Asia and India. He was in the room where the ancient world's most consequential strategic decisions were made, and he was the room. He was the decision and the army and the vision and the specific human will that, more than any other force, shaped the 3 centuries between his death and the rise of Rome into the form they took. He was buried in Egypt eventually, in a golden sarcophagus in a mausoleum in Alexandria, where his body was visited by Caesar and Augustus and the other great men of the following centuries who wanted to see the thing itself, the man around whom the entire legend had crystallized, and to measure themselves against it. The mausoleum was lost in the late antique period and has not been found, despite repeated searches in the urban archaeology of modern Alexandria. He is somewhere in the city he founded and named for himself, in the Mediterranean earth, having been there for 23 centuries, and the city is still there above him, and the Mediterranean is still there, and the specific quality of the light on the Egyptian coast in the late afternoon, golden and exact, is probably not very different from what it was when he first looked at the site and decided to build something permanent. Let that settle around you now. The plains of Asia are dark tonight, and the mountains are cold, and the rivers are doing what they have always done. A long way from where you are lying, in the earth of a city that still bears his name, the most extraordinary 32 years in the history of any civilization has been at rest for 2,300 years. The story is told. The cities are built. The languages have changed and the religions have changed and the empires have risen and fallen. But somewhere in the foundations of the intellectual world you inhabit, in the mathematics, in the medicine, in the philosophical tradition, in the religious vocabulary, in the specific shape of the ideas that move through the culture you live in, the consequences of what happened between 334 and 323 BCE are still present, transformed beyond recognition but continuous, the way that rivers are continuous even when the water is entirely different from what it was upstream. Rest easy.